I want to take just a very quick, sort of abrupt turn here because it's been a while since we talked, and there's been a lot of sort of victories on the social liberalism front, but not so much on the economic liberalism front, as it were. I mean, there's maybe been some sort of, I guess, I don't know, some default or not major losses, but just give me your sense. I mean, over the past year, we've seen the sort of the reversal of what was, at least in 2004, maybe even in 2008, the perspective on women's rights in some ways, particularly abortion rights, sort of more fervently adopted by the Democratic Party. We have seen the fall of homophobia essentially as a leverage point for conservatives, and now is a leverage point for liberalism. We saw a similar thing, I think, that's happening to some degree on immigration, though I don't know if we're going to be able to get any type of meaningful reform, but that remains to be seen. What do you make of that sea change, which I think is pretty dramatic over the past 18 months, even 2 years, but not so much in terms of economic liberalism?
Yeah, I think that's basically right. I do think that the austerity caucus is on weaker footing now than it was a year ago. Wouldn't you agree?
Which is not necessarily yes, I would agree with that. Which is not necessarily a victory. It's more of like a
no. It's not a victory. It's just that the things have stopped moving in a bad direction.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like they are not moving. It's not like the things that would be great to do, which is like essentially the Federal Reserve, forgive a bunch of debt or a massive stimulus or huge principal
increasing Social Security benefits, dropping the retirement age.
Right, exactly. Like all sorts of the proactive things that I think you and I agree would be awesome are not at all on the political horizon, but at least the people who are advocating the worst, most destructive forms of policy aren't the most empowered actors in American politics, which about a year ago they were, essentially. And in some ways, we're living with the vestigial consequences of that empowerment in the Budget Control Act, which created the sequester, which is the thing that is the next kind of austerity crunch.
And I got to say, the reason why that austerity push, I think, is slowed has basically come at the expense of a tremendous amount of suffering in Europe. I mean, in the past 12 months, we've got the IMF coming out and saying essentially like, "Oh, we were wrong about that." I mean,
well, you know what the other thing though is? I think part of it has to do with the fact that there was a misunderstanding. There was a misunderstanding of the politics and the mandate that I think Republicans had, right? This is a big fixed belief of mine, which I'm open to being wrong on this, but so far all my observations and data have confirmed it, which may be confirmation bias, but I'm sticking with it for now, which is that like no one actually cares about the deficit. No one actually cares about the size of government in the abstract, right? People care about their current situation, or they care about a set of principles and beliefs they have, or they care about what their affiliations are with other people in their coalitions and how welcome they feel in that. But people just don't care about the deficit. And so there is actually no domestic democratic constituency for austerity. There just is not. The Tea Party misunderstood their large victory in 2010 as being an expression of there being a real powerful, concentrated domestic constituency for austerity, and that wasn't it. It was basically people were ticked off that there was a Democratic president and the economy was bad, and so they showed up in a kind of expression of backlash, right? Mm-hmm. And the electorate lost a lot of the people who had voted for Barack Obama who are not, midterm voters, and that produced this Tea Party class that then actually those voters don't actually want to see things like cuts to Medicare or Social Security. They just don't, right? So part of the reason they've lost their power is because there is elite constituency there are interests who really want austerity, but there is just not a very big actual democratic constituency of citizens for it.
Right, but I mean, is there? I mean, when austerity is imposed, is there ever? I mean,
right. I mean, in some ways, that's the whole thesis of Naomi Klein's shock doctrine, right? Which is that in every case that you have harsh austerity imposed, it cannot be imposed in any kind of overwhelming democratic fashion because no one wants to shock themselves, right? It always has to be either imposed in crisis or imposed by creditors who have undue force, or imposed in some way that is not a kind of bottom-up imposition. I think that's broadly true. I mean,
so in some respect, the lament that those of us on the left have that President Obama missed his opportunity to institute some real financial reforms and perhaps to create a more progressive role for government. The window for those austeritarians, if you will, has also closed in some respects.
I think it has. I mean, it hasn't in a cyclical fashion. I mean, the irony is that, they are their own worst enemy time and time again. I mean, they have saved progressives from deals that we would have hated a whole bunch of times. I mean, had they come to the table early on health care, they could have had some small piecemeal thing that was, a third of the size of the ACA. Had they come to the table during the debt ceiling negotiations, they probably could have had changes to Medicare eligibility or something else awful like that. Even during this latest round in the lame duck, if they come to the table on that, they never do. And part of the reason they never do, I think, is there's two theories for that. One is that they're, implacable radicals. The other is that they recognize that their voters don't want that, right?
Right.
I mean, in some ways, the whole game has been, in some ways, to try to psych the Democrats into being the ones to do something like raising the Medicare eligibility age and then run against the Democrats as the party that raised the eligibility
Well, that's what
age.
they did in 2010 in many respects with the Medicare. Right. Right. And go ahead.
So the reason that they missed their moment in some ways is an outgrowth of the fact that, again, like I said, the politics were never there to produce the results that they said they had the mandate to produce.
And in some respects, the Democrats just were just almost there. I mean, I think it was quite clear that President Obama was there. It's just that he clearly was willing to put on the table those type of cuts. It's just, I think that whatever, I guess by hook or crook, it just didn't work out. I mean,
and one thing I will say for the president so far, whatever his intentions were, and I think a lot of times he was really willing to make deals that I think you and I would think were awful. It is remarkable that we've gotten out of the last 2 years of a Tea Party caucus and in the House and sort of empowered in the Senate without any real permanent changes to the big social programs. There were some permanent changes that were in the way Medicare is going to make payments that were in the Affordable Care Act. But you could have imagined, something like raising the eligibility age, something like changing the calculation of CPI and Social Security, things that aren't just aspects of the cyclical budget that have to get relitigated everywhere by nature, but are actually permanent alterations to parts of the social safety net. And so far, we have managed to avoid permanent alterations to the basic structures and eligibilities of the safety net, even if there has been cyclical austerity imposed, which has been, tremendously destructive and will continue to be tremendously destructive, but has the advantage of being something that, by definition, has to get refought over every year.
Right. I mean, it's essentially. I mean, defense is. I mean, and of course, to a certain extent, defense is easier in some respects, particularly when you're in the Alamo.
Particularly when you're defending popular programs.
Right. Yes.
Right. I mean, that's the other thing, right? Like, people don't the polling. You talked about this, and we talked about it on my show, and a lot of people talked about it. I mean, when they were floating raising the Medicare eligibility age, which was gonna close the deficit as much as basically, I want to say the same amount as all the tax extenders increased the deficit. It was not that much money at all, right?
Right.
when they talked about raising the Medicare eligibility age, they did polling on it. It was like you couldn't find
70s or 80s.
the idea.
Yes. I mean, you could walk through a crowd at, a Glenn Beck rally, and still, that's the one thing that they would all agree on. Yeah, no cutting Medicare.